Welcome to Empower Richmond. We're going to be talking about cyber with my very good friend, Biju George. If you don't know who I am, I'm Alan Hinchman. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer for GrayMatter, and we are excited to be here. Biju and I have been in the water industry for a lot of years. Me personally, I'm pushing 25, maybe even almost into 30 years. And I know, Biju, you've been there before. But for a lot of folks that don't know your background, which I don't know if there'll be many, maybe just give us a quick introduction.
Thanks, Alan. Thank you so much for what you do, and GrayMatter's as part of GrayMatter's what you all do for the water sector. Been a customer for many years of you all. So I've been with the city of Cincinnati for almost 25 years. I started as a maintenance engineer, and then served the sewer department, the Metropolitan Sewer District (MSD), as their deputy director for many years, and then I was the executive director of Cincinnati Water for a few years before I moved to DC Water as their chief operating officer. Working for George Hawkins while he was a CEO. And then later I was the executive vice president of operations and engineering under the new CEO, David Gaddis, until I left DC Water about 6 months ago to work for a technology firm.
You know, Biju, over our times in the last, say, from the late 90s into today, I think the water industry has seen a lot of things come and go, a lot of challenges that we faced into, from the lead crisis in the 80s to combined sewer challenges to infrastructure challenges. But I'm interested in what's the thing that you think is most important today that water utilities are thinking on and building strategies for the next 5-10 years around?
Alan, I can think of many, but since you asked for the most important one, I will have to summarize that as resilience. The ability for a water sector to withstand, whether it's the issues related to climate change or issues related to aging population, aging employees, and retirement, and or the latest one, with the state act sponsored terrorism and as such cybersecurity. So the resiliency of a utility to overcome the challenges and then continue to provide that service in a very reliable way, the high quality water. So that I see as the biggest challenge in front of them.
So let me just double click a little bit into one of those, because I think each one of them could be their own empowers. But when we think about today, we're thinking through cybersecurity. And how have the cybersecurity needs changed over the past couple of years as more and more folks are beginning to go remote and changing the way their operations are executed?
Yeah, so I will start with the most recent realization. Because the state-sponsored terrorism. Because that's a real threat, and now we all know that how vulnerable we could be. Under such threat. The second one is, we have seen the increased attack on the water sector. Starting from things that happen in Florida. Atlanta, Baltimore, many of those. So we are not safe. We are a target for the cyber attackers. And then, as you mentioned, the remote workforce that has significantly increased the threat surface that we are exposing for breaches. And finally, because it's not just the utility themselves. Our partners, utility partners as the technology suppliers, providers. That has been significantly increasing, and that in itself, because a compromise with any one of them can be a serious threat to the utility. So the threat surface is significantly increasing. And we have always, been very reluctant in combining and looking, the entire system, both operating and OT and the IT system together for as an integrated view, and that in itself is a threat as well.
You mentioned the threat surface on a couple of occasions in there, and absolutely, if you think the systems that we're running today were designed a number of years ago with connectivity and simplicity in mind. And I think that's causing some of the challenges for utilities. But how would you suggest that agencies evaluate their cyber risk on this ever-increasing attack surface, along with all of the, I would say, residual older equipment that they have? and understand exactly what their cyber risk is and how are they going to equate that to a level of spending based on their size, maybe.
So Alan, it's a two-part question. So let me handle the first part. I mean, how a utility could look into the systems, and then I'll come back to the second part. I mean, maybe looking into the funding or budgeting for it. So on the first side, I mean, because there are, I mean, it depends on where you are in your level of maturity with assessing your system, identifying all your infrastructure, digital infrastructure, and then identifying at risk. I mean, that's the first step. If you haven't started, I mean, that's a place to begin. And then the second part, you have to go into, the vulnerabilities, your weaknesses, I mean, through whether you are employing a penetration test or other ways of finding out your vulnerabilities. That's the second phase to go. But if you are a utility who has already went through all that, and some other, some of the risk mitigation systems are already in place, then you have to adopt a little more mature activities. I mean, especially, I mean, focusing more on your employees, human assets. I mean, how do you strengthen them, making them less vulnerable to social engineering and related activities? Which, of course, you have to start with that in the beginning. But again, I mean, you can take that one level up with the various training. And then finally, the one that I've been advocating lately is looking end-to-end to a process. If you're already taken a horizontal view of your system, what I mean that is, if you're a water utility and energy utility, take a value stream like a meter to cash. So you look at all the vulnerability, the data transfer starting from your meter all the way to customer money is being received and put it in the bank, and then see that what are the level of vulnerabilities, what are your threat surfaces, and then how do you mitigate those? So you have a very clear view of how you manage that within each of your value chain. You can apply that to anything else, whether it's vendor management or your other, third-party services. So you can apply that in a systematic way to the other areas. So depending on where you are in your maturity, you can elevate that to the next level and then move forward. Now, coming back to your second question, how do you budget for that? Again, I can get that into a little more detail, I mean, with some of the opportunities that is being present. But again, I mean, if you are, that 400 or so utilities with more than 100,000 customers, you are reasonably funded with the revenue to do a little bit more support. But if you are smaller than that, it would be extremely difficult to fund a full-time, cybersecurity CISO or analyst and things like that. So there are solutions, that marketplace solutions that are available for such utilities that where you can use as a fractional service from a service provider, a managed service provider, to take a virtual CISO. And there are many market options that are available. They are very much matured and as well as reliable.
Biju, you're one of the individuals that fits into a unique category of people where you've managed county and city, and also other agencies like at DC Water, where you're set up with a bunch of shareholders. I think this question is the one that's on everyone's mind, and it's been the IT versus OT. So if I'm a county municipal leader, how do I make sure that I've got a seat at the table? Are our IT departments thinking about OT cybersecurity today, or how does that craft, and what's been your experience around that?
Alan, as we both have been in the sector for many years, as the early days of IT, the OT folks kept the IT as much they could away from their system, and they maintain an air gap for the right reasons, though, because we were automating our system, heavily reliant on the SCADA system and the OT system. But today, that margin is almost non-existent. I mean, because we have business systems that are integrating into the OT system relying on business system to get information, and then third-party service providers. So there can't be any more, an IT approach to security and an OT approach to security. It is an integrated approach to security. On the same token, anymore. Because if you look at the asset management plan for many water utilities, even some of the ones I've fortunate to work with, you will see only the physical infrastructure replacement in the asset replacement plan, and the IT asset replacement plan is totally different or independent. I think it is time to bring those together, because since IT and OT is getting integrated, because if you don't update your digital infrastructure or fully go through that digital transformation, your physical infrastructure can be left behind because of how much we rely on digital infrastructure to support and enhance our services that we provide the customer. So both from an asset management perspective, as well as a management perspective, it needs to be integrated.
Biju, you hit on a button I find extraordinarily interesting. Is I think there's been this idea of siloed, whether it was this is my LIMS system and it's self-contained, whether this is my CMMS system and it's self-contained. I agree with you that what we really need are these integrated systems. So many data points begin from the historical databases of the PLC SCADA system, but also need to be tied out with your AMR system or your LIMS system. And now we're seeing an increased amount of asset management going on that also ties back to the PLCs. And as you begin to automate all of those systems together, the connectivity is higher and higher. One of the things that I think personally a lot of utilities miss is also managing and monitoring those network assets. So we know the health of a PLC typically in a SCADA system. You know the health of a SCADA server because it's either on or off in front of your eyes. But knowing here's what the data from my switches and my firewalls and my hubs and through that entire Purdue model begins to kind of play out. And so we at GrayMatter have been a firm believer that you want to tie those things together, monitor them in equal measure, and then be able to have a very well-defined structure. And so that's one of the things that we've been doing. I guess, what's your thoughts around what a good, better, best formula for investing in cyber looks like?
Sure. Again, because again, I'll go back to my previous comment about the maturity. Because, it's like anything else you're starting into. Cybersecurity is a practice that you have to start and then take it to a level of higher and higher maturity. And then that is going to grow with you over the years. You're not going to get to a best and it stops there. You have to continue to better yourself, because the actors, the threat actors on the other side, they're always trying to beat you. And they have to beat you only once, but you have to be right all the time. So you cannot take your eye off that cybersecurity continuously. So having said that, so if you are just on the starting into cybersecurity, and then my suggestion would be start immediately with the assessment, penetration test, and have a plan ready. Because you need that as a base for no matter what you do, because your funding requests and also the opportunities in the offing. Because there are many opportunities I can test that, especially related to leveraging the some of the the federal funding that's available both from the CISA as well as the state revolving funds. So there are such opportunities. They all require that. If every utility was required to prepare a resiliency plan by 2018. Most of them are been through some extent making that happen. So if you already have that, that is a good start. Take your cybersecurity plan and then take it to the next level. But once you already have a plan, then you have at least a roadmap to get to the next level. So this is the second tier I'm talking about. So if you have some level of cybersecurity, because you already have a plan, you have your your vulnerabilities, you have some training for your staff going on, then it's time for you to take it to the next level. Because instead of assuming that because you have achieved everything, how do you take yourself to the next level so you can continue on your maturity? Now, if you are already have good practices, then you need to really challenge yourself to the next level, because at that point it becomes a mindset. that if I were to lead a utility, because as a leader, my mindset would be not under my watch. That means a completely different way of preparing yourself and getting there. And that's when the best of us or what we can do will evolve.
I think it's interesting that if you were to ask a number of folks that are not very far into this journey, they think cybersecurity is a piece of hardware that gets installed and then they just don't worry about it. What you're saying is this is a mindset. This is a fundamental shift in the way that you're managing the utility, and that not just a piece of equipment is going to make a difference, but as you get through this good, better, best, the backside of that is you have employees thinking about how do they protect digital assets. That begins to change the way that the operating DNA is. Are there ways to kind of think about it? And when you look at the manpower piece of this, is there ways of thinking about how do you drive those into it? How do you drive that mindset?
Sure. I think water utilities, this is nothing new for us, because we went through this with bioterrorism, the early 2000s following the 9/11. Because that was a major threat. We learned how to evaluate our risks and then manage that risk. And then, we have successfully managed through that, as a water utilities and getting there. So I don't think from that perspective, this is nothing new for us, but it's, as you said, we discussed before, how do we bring that more to the forefront, given all the opportunities and increase vulnerabilities, and then take actions based on that. Mm-hmm. So once security become a priority, it become as part of everything we do. It's like safety, because most meetings do start with the safety moment. Why is that? Because we want to keep that is on the forefront. Same way, the cybersecurity has to become a mindset, because you have to have regular testing of through phishing emails and social engineering, just to test that how vulnerable our employees are. And then if you see that the same employee compromising multiple times, then there should be some level of actions, corrective action. So they would be more careful, and especially extremely busy executives and managers, because they all are vulnerable, for some of these calls. The only way the social engineering and the phishing exercises, the only way we can overcome that is by constantly challenging ourselves to overcome that. So that's on the front end of it. Then dealing with the malwares and those kind of issues, just to be sure that, because when we touch an email, and then making sure that, so there are many training available, I'm sure the employees are providing it. But then once it goes past the human aspect of it, then that is those are the ones that you are referring to. We will be controlling through either a device or a software, making sure that we control things to the extent possible. And those are very effective, but the most vulnerable piece is the human aspect of it, and that's the one we have to pay more attention once you secure through software. When I say software, the patching that is required, as well as some other devices that you guys promote and then serve the industry with.
So it's interesting. It really sounds like it's driving a level of accountability that is appropriate with every level in the utility. Kind of into that same vein, we're beginning to see and hear of pending EPA and NIST standardization and rules coming out. And so as the federal government begins to take a look at this, and they've made a couple of inroads into that with the requirements of cities to report ransomware payouts and things like that. What do you think is going to be the kind of the reaction that comes around the federal government involvement in some of the things that are coming down around standardization and regulation?
So personally, I welcome that because water is probably the last sector that doesn't have a standard for themselves. So if you look at NERC, for the energy sector, they had it for a while. Because it was a standard, it was a requirement. For that, they are much better off than other utilities. Over the water sector. So the requirements that's coming, especially for the funding, that's available now. And also, if you happen to expend some of the funds for cybersecurity, the accountability that comes from it, that calls for standards. So how do we prepare ourselves for the vulnerabilities? How do we build those? And what are the minimum standards that we need to comply? And finally, I think the much more required standards that need to go in the contract specification for our service providers, that also need to be standardized. There is no reason why 10 different utilities have 10 different standards for their vendors, because that will be so difficult to follow. So a standard is much more required for the third-party vendors. For example, your healthcare provider, that can be easily compromised because they have all the HIPAA information and all that, with them. So unless they take actions to conform to the security that it requires, you stand exposed to the same vulnerability. So making sure that you develop those standards as well. So it's not only the standards as a water sector that we need to follow for ourselves, but also the kind of standards that we need to give it to our IoT suppliers, our control system hardware suppliers, software suppliers, and our third-party vendors. That is critical. So for all that purposes, we do need standards.
That makes a ton of sense. I guess one of the last pieces that I really wanted to cover was with standardization, with changing the DNA of your utility around cyber. I think one of the huge questions that folks have are, what are the funding vehicles that are available to you as a utility? And I know state revolving funds have got some interesting pieces in there that I think a lot of folks aren't aware of. Could you maybe cover where those would fit in and how you could use those money for cybersecurity?
Sure, absolutely. I think one of the most underutilized tool that's available to many utilities are the state revolving funds, and the EPA has a circle around that. You can easily find that on EPA's website or just by Googling for state revolving fund and cybersecurity. That will provide funds for not only investments in cyber-related security system, but also for training, employee training, and as such, anything related to that. So that's a source that's certainly underutilized. But of course, taking those funds and implementing cybersecurity certainly do come with a level of responsibility as well. So you have to make sure that you are meeting some objective outcome-based criteria. That way, it's not just a spend on a report that sits on on a shelf, but it's some actionable or some actions that follows or implementation of a technology and training. Those are effective. The second part and the most interesting part to me is the bipartisan infrastructure. The funding that was approved in November. It's almost I think it was like $1.2 trillion, of which about $1 billion+ that is dedicated for cybersecurity. The only difference is, because for most of the federal actions and then transfer of funds, they are typically EPA is the primacy agency, and most of the funds are transferred through EPA. But in this case, there's a slight difference, and that's why utilities will have to be a little more careful in their preparation and how they get ready for that. So, as you all already know, because under the Department of Homeland Security, there is an agency called as CISA, which stands for Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. I think they've been in existence for 3+ years or closer to that. So that's the funds are for flowing through them. The funds are dedicated to them. They are the responsible agencies to distribute those funds. So they are supposed to come. I think the funds. So there are two parts of that funding. The first $1 billion that will be expended as grants over the next 4 years. So the first part of the first tranche is about $200 million that has to be spent in the current fiscal year. So this is you're talking about federal fiscal year, so which starts on October 1st and ends on September 30th. So if they are true to the requirement, that money, the $200 million, need to be spent by September 30th. And CISA still hasn't come up with a plan what it requires to, or how you qualify for that. So utilities better be ready. These funds will be distributed through the states and the counties and the cities and villages. So that's where the focus is. And so most likely, it will be distributed through FEMA. That's the most efficient arm of DHS to spend those funds. So the remaining funds, I think for the fiscal year 2023, it's $400 million, and 2024 is $300 million, and 2025 is $100 million. That's accounting for that whole $1 billion investment in cybersecurity. I think it's a tremendous opportunity, especially for the very small and medium utilities, because there is an expectation of these funds. Actually, 80% of this will be spent among the most deserving communities. Those who are financially struggling, remote, small. So this is a great opportunity to actually build the small communities to a level of competency in cybersecurity, leveraging this fund, and then they can leverage more of the digital transformation can be a part of and get the full benefit of it. Then there is another about $250 million in addition to this, the $1 billion, which is for rural and municipal utility. That's for advanced cybersecurity and technical assistance that directly come from CISA. So I don't have a whole lot of details on that one, but again, because there are no published documents I could find, but that's additional funds that's available. So in essence, I think those who are prepared to take advantage of it, there is plenty of money that's available, but you have to have a plan. Just to secure this money. They are not. I don't think they will be handing out, though they don't have a plan out. So preparing for that would be critical. So I can touch on the, some level, maybe what are some other ways at least I think could maximize the benefit.
So to wrap it up, I appreciate you being here, Biju. A lot of great information there. Maybe just give us a little bit of the importance of finding the right partners. As we look at this from a GrayMatter perspective, we're seeing a lot of folks coming out of the IT world, coming out of other industries, DoD, places like that, manufacturing. But I think finding folks that understand how the water industry manages and works and how the accountability layers need to do as you move into this cybersecurity mindset that's akin to safety. What's the reason that you've gone into private practice recently and you're kind of thinking through this? We're spending a lot of time on these type of topics, but just give us a little bit of an input of what picking the right partner with the right history can bring in value.
Sure. Again, the main reason I moved to the technology side is, I always felt that there is a real need for those who really understand water sector to provide service. You guys have been in this business for many years providing automation. So you grew in that space, automating a sector fully, manually operated system. So you understand the maturity that went through and where the sector is, and then, where we are now in an early start going from there. So having a partner, private, public partnership, and then how do you jointly solve this problem is critical. You don't want, water sector, unlike other sectors, water sector, we need reliability. We need people, companies that can be trusted upon as a trusted partner and stay with us forever than, create more risk for us. So it's extremely critical that how do we select our partners for this. And the second part is the experience. Because you have to have dedicated staff with dedicated experience. You cannot have, shops that looking for a service and then trying to assemble with whoever they can find and then come and offer that as a service, or something else is their main focus. And now, here is an opportunity. So they added on it. So look for shops and offerings who have significant experience with the OT system and IT system, and then cybersecurity is a significant part of their offering, complement of that. So those would be my suggestion, or something that I would have looked for when I was, running a utility or being responsible for that. It's very tempting to have your audit firm or financial firms with a cybersecurity practice to look into and then make some suggestions. I mean, that's all good. Sometimes that's required as part of your financial statement or as a board mandate. But look for somebody with a very strong experience in this area and then very reliable and sustainable business.
Great. Well, it was a pleasure chatting with you. We're right on our time, so take care. And if anyone needs anything, you can get a hold of myself or Biju throughout the day, and we'll be happy to answer any questions. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Ellen. Thank you for this opportunity.
All right, for our next session, I want to welcome Tim Jencka and Scott Christensen from GrayMatter. Hey guys, how you doing?
Hi. Doing well, Jeremy. How are you?
Good, doing well. Thanks to you both for being here at emPOWERUP Live. We're really happy to have you and lucky to have you here. So actually, I want to get right into our Q&A today. So Scott, we'll start with you, and just right off the top, what's your top recommendation for water utilities that are trying to look at their cybersecurity and strengthen the protections that they have in place?
So I think there's two big pieces to that. When you're starting off your program, you're trying to figure out what to do. I think the first is, have you identified your critical assets? Have you identified your threats? Just that basic identify category, right? This could be an assessment, it could be a tool, it could be whatever, but just that starting component. And then the second, I think probably I'd almost call it 1A and 1B, is start defining your boundaries. Because I think that's one thing a lot of people struggle with is they don't know where their boundaries from the IT to the OT to between the internet and their business. I mean, it's when you start defining your boundaries, then you can decide what's allowed to transact those boundaries, and it allows you to get a little bit more control over the traffic that's coming and going from your network. And I think those are kind of the two steps I think are very achievable steps that people should look when they're initializing kind of a cyber program in OT.
Is that something that you typically find utilities have already done or haven't done for the most part? Kind of, how does that break down?
It's a mixed bag, right? So
Yeah.
you're typically your larger utilities have done this, right? Your major cities, they usually have a very defined critical infrastructure. You'll hear people reference the Purdue model or PARA model, Purdue Enterprise Reference Architecture. You got 5 levels, starting with the internet down to your actual controllers and separating based on the functionality of the asset. So a lot of people see that as the gold standard, but a lot of times there's a lot of organizations with so much shared architecture and infrastructure where everything's just this big flat network. And if I'm on the process network, I can see everything on the business network, and inverse is true. And so that's where we start trying to discuss is where do we want to define those perimeters, put those controls in place between them, and then add visibility of, do I really know what's coming into my network? And do I really want to allow this out of my network, right? Those kind of
Mm-hmm.
exfiltration and infiltration controls you want to put in place.
Absolutely. Tim, I want to bring you into the conversation here. So
Sure.
what are some of the things that you hear from water, wastewater customers, and really any industrial customer that they kind of struggle with, most often when they're thinking about a cybersecurity strategy?
Oh, well, for some, depending on their scale, Jeremy, it's where do I start, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that's one of the things that dovetails into Scott's comments. Typically, people will start, well, we need an assessment, right? And some executive read an article in the back of an airline magazine from one of the big 4 that says you have to assess early and often, and that's great if you have the resources and the staff to digest and then act on the elements of the assessment. But the reality is the broader part of the market is small to mid-size organizations that simply don't have those kind of resources. So if you want to start with an assessment, our recommendation is always, well, let's get an assessment that actually produces visible, tangible results. And the tech we're talking about here today plugs in nicely with that. So there's no need to wait 6 months to a year or 3 months to 6 to assess if we can start compensating controls today, right? To protect where you stand.
Absolutely. Yeah. So let's talk about some of that tech. So how does GrayMatter's approach, to securely monitoring remote distributed industrial assets, kind of stand out? Scott, and then Tim on that one.
Yeah, so there's a couple pieces to the way we approach it. One is a true layered defense in depth strategy, right? Is having multiple layers of different technologies supporting your security program, right? There's multiple reasons for that, but the simplest one is if a vulnerability affects one concept or technology, it's not going to impact your whole security program, right? So if you think about it, I've got a firewall. It's the most common answer we hear. I'm good. I've got a firewall. Well, firewalls can be, have exploits. They have vulnerabilities get disclosed. And if you're only relying on that single point of failure to protect your infrastructure, if it's exposed, everything's exposed. So first is let's look at where the areas that we can augment our traditional security mechanisms. That's the first. And then the second is understanding what is good and what is bad so that you can decide what should be allowed or not allowed to happen in your network. When you look at the technology we talk about today, for example, the most basic of that is if I'm a small utility in central United States, do I really want to see traffic coming from Eastern Europe? Right? If it's my ICS, it's my SCADA infrastructure. Should I be getting those call homes from those Eastern Bloc countries, or should I say that's never going to be a good thing for my control system? Let me clean up that. And that's just a simple context. You can get more complex with it, but I think starting off with, do I have the data that I want in my network, and am I able to stop the data I don't want? That's kind of the basics of where I would start off with, kind of improving and putting the right controls in place. In the way we approach it is making sure we understand what's coming and going and deciding if this is validated good traffic or is this invalidated malicious traffic and preventing it from happening.
Tim, do you want to elaborate on that a little bit too?
Absolutely, Scott. I think the key word there is context. It's king.
Yeah.
Context is king in this wire speed kind of analysis, and to leverage Scott's point. So it gets more complicated. Should it be coming from Eastern Europe? Because what if one of the pieces of technology that you've deployed and that is working and great, it's doing its job, but it needs to get back to one of those East Latvia for updates? Okay, you probably can't afford today to rip all of that stuff out of your network, and you might be bound by policy to get updates. And so what about a tool or a solution, right? A piece of tech that can say, all right, I'm going to let this device specifically connect with that server, update server only for this period of time during the day and nothing else, right? And that's key. That's why that context is so important. And you have to be able to glean that context in a fashion that you can use it, right? Not just think about it, right? You have to be able to use it. And the technology we're talking about today has that native. It's like Prego. It's in there.
And I even go a little bit farther. The other part about it too is technology that if one aspect of my environment learns a behavior, a policy, something I do not or want to allow, my whole infrastructure should learn it. It should not be an administrative lift to say, oh, I noticed some strange traffic trying to talk this remote water station. And I now have to create policy for all my other, hundreds of remote stations. I should be able to learn it here and apply it everywhere. We talk a lot of times about the hive mind, right? That's the thing Tim and I love about the concept of if I learn something here, my AI now can develop the policy and rules that deploy it across my infrastructure. I don't require this massive administrative lift where someone goes into my CLI and they're writing a bunch of code to say, oh, we don't want this at this water tower. We don't want it at this one. I'm not spreading it across. It's automatically happening for me, making it efficient and automated. The same way we automate in efficiencies everywhere else, I should be able to do some of that within my security paradigm too.
And that kind of gets me into that ROI conversation too, because that frees up your resources, your technical staff to focus on other things, right? Because they're not having to dive in, every time and write new rules.
Right. Absolutely. Tim talks about this a lot, and it's one of my favorite anecdotes, and I'll just set him up for it. But probably my favorite anecdote is you pay for every IP that touches your network. If you wanted it there or not, you pay for it in some way, shape, or form. and I'll let Tim kind of give a little bit more depth into this, but that's
Sure.
eliminating me paying for the stuff I don't want on my network is kind of a core to the ROI. Go ahead, Tim. I
Sure.
set you up the best I could.
It's one of the cool things of the way deception guard and remote guard that we're talking about here today leverage a capability. I mean, think about that for all of us, whether that's at work in your water system or at home, right? You are responsible. Your network edge, your security tools are responsible for every IP address on the planet. And so whether that's a client or whether that's a third-party service provider, great, we want those. But think about the second cell phone in somebody's pocket in Bangladesh. That if it has access to the internet, it can find you, and your firewall, that firewall you said you had, has to do something with it. Hopefully it's set properly to drop the connection request, but it does nothing to that IP. It can come back and do that 10,000 times this hour, right? And so as good security soldiers, we're following compliance. We'll say, all right, let's keep dropping that, and we're going to log our drops, and we're going to put them in our SIM, and someone's going to analyze them, and we're going to have to store that for our retention period from an IP address they would never, ever, ever want to talk to, or don't get within a mile of our treatment facility. So having a technology that understands that context of who are you, where are you, what are you, why are you, right? And keep it away from my crown jewels is critical. And it needs to do that at wire speed. And that's what we're talking about here.
Yeah, and I think I'm eliminating white noise. That alone, right? If I take the white noise, that overhead, that chatter, that we still have to manage, we have to deal with, even if it's reject it, block it, we're logging it, all this thing, all that white noise is being handled by my critical infrastructure. At some point or another, a firewall, a router, a switch manages and handles it, a log aggregator, a SIM tool now records and stores it. So all that has got some level of cost, some more than others. If you look at like SIM tools, and I got volumetric pricing, or if I just look at the licensing cost of certain models of firewalls, right? I'm having to deal with that in some way, shape, or form. By eliminating the white noise, now I'm investing in infrastructure that is only responsible for the network traffic I want. So now all of a sudden I can now stay a model lower on my firewall than I needed to. So all that extra overhead is not required because I'm not letting it establish a session into my network. I don't have to log all these IP addresses as they touch my router because they're not even getting to my network at this point. So it doesn't go into my SIM tool, which is volumetrically priced, right? So I'm not these little hidden costs that we don't really think about. They're all attached to my network today, that when you look at security as an ROI, it's a rare thing. But when I say I can eliminate a lot of that white noise, allow you to prolong the life or the model level of your firewall, slow down the volume of traffic that's ingested to your SIM, those are all costs that are associated with an IP showing up that I didn't want on my network to begin with.
Perfect.
So that's really what we're starting talking about. ROI is, let's get rid of the white noise. And also think about it from this perspective. You're a limited body cyber team. You're an OT. Those are also things I now have to pay someone to analyze. Why was this on my network? Why did it do this? I have to put all these additional efforts to make sure, what did it impact? What happened? What changed? Even if it didn't really do anything, I now have to take a resource and let them focus on the forensic side of it. When if it never let it establish a session, I don't have to worry about it. It has zero impact on my network because I didn't allow it to call home. I didn't allow it to come into my network.
Right.
And that can really add up in terms of ROI. Like, it's a significant amount of money depending on how large of a company you are.
We have a client here that talks to various industry groups. The last presentation was an ONG ISAC, and that particular client had reduction in cost enough in their volumetrically priced SIM tool that was managed by a third party to pay for an enterprise-wide database security suite with no incremental budget request. Out of the reduction in the bill from the service provider for the SIM, paid for the database security element, enterprise-wide. I mean, serious money, right? And for stuff that if you could call your carrier and say, never, ever, never, ever send this to me, it wouldn't have happened, but they'd laugh at you when you do that. Here's an alternative.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think that's good on ROI. Some good examples there. So, if people want to know how to get started, kind of evaluating their cyber readiness, where do you tell them to get started with that, Scott?
So there's two pieces, right? So
Yeah.
one is Tim already covered a little bit about the assessment, right? And
Mhm.
it's critical. And you'll never hear me not love. I got double negative all over the place there, but I always love assessments. How about that? That's a better way to put it.
Yeah.
But specifically, the reason I love assessments, a good assessment, and I think Tim's nuanced discussion, right? A good assessment should do a couple things. One, it should prioritize my risk. It shouldn't just be, hey, here's all your problems, go fix them. It should prioritize what are the things I have that are highest risk that I can address. Secondarily, it should require achievable goals, right? These are things we know you can do, right? Telling you to lift the world when you can't lift the world does no good if I say that in an assessment report, right? But if I say, here are the steps you can take that mitigate challenges, put controls in place, that's key. So that's the first thing, is get an assessment that allows you to have actionable data. And I think the other aspect of an assessment that's pretty important is make sure that they define the difference between perceived risk and actual risk. Because if I look at a lot of standards and compliance, they say, oh, these are all these things you have to worry about. But if you have the compensating controls, I really don't have to worry about those. They're not as big a concern because I've already mitigated that risk as a priority. So let me go focus on the areas that I have not mitigated. The second, and I think this is where it's going to lead into the tech conversation, right, is utilize the value of your vendors from a proof of value concept. A few years ago, we always used to call things POCs. Now we moved into POVs. The reason we moved that away is I should be able to deploy a tool and see, is this a value to our infrastructure? So I encourage you to go, look at tools that allow you to test out how this looks in my environment. Does it mitigate my risk? Does it give me actionable data? Does it put some controls in place that allow me to move forward? Those are the tools that I want to really promote, right? Things that allow you to kick the tires in a risk-free way. That's pretty valuable. See if this is going to work for you, and if a product or a partner doesn't want to work with you on that, I think you put those aside and start focusing on the ones that do want to collaborate with you. Let's deploy this, make sure I get value out of it, make sure this fits my needs, and put it together in a long-term strategy. I think that's the other aspect, is we tend to think in small snippets of time, 3, 6, 9 months.
Sure.
But when you're putting in a security product, just like any other technology in OT, thinking 1, 2, 3, 5 years out, right? That's the program you want to build. Is, can I build a program that in 5 years I'm still comfortable with, and I'm not trying to invest in the next great mousetrap? And I think those become really key value points from a security program. What's my long-term strategy, Tim?
Yeah, I think to build on the value point, the point, those elements that Scott's talking about are critical. And when you're shopping for an assessor, you need to ask every one of those questions and then pause and wait for a good answer, right?
Mm-hmm.
The other part is that let's think about making the assessments active. So when we look at the way we've deployed Deception Guard, right, we can insert these devices for a short period of time in a POV, part of an assessment kind of thing, and actually show you where traffic is flowing into and out of your network. Scenarios that you might not consider, right? Traffic leaving the environment. What's going on a port we like? There's my firewall again, letting traffic out. But does your firewall tell you where in the world it's going? So maybe it's going to the UK, and that's fine. But where in the UK is it going? And so this multi-context component of the tech shines brilliant lights onto how traffic is flowing. And another similar related, say you had a service provider that used to have a relationship, but you've terminated for whatever reason and you've moved down the road. If you still see traffic, if we see during an assessment traffic from that service provider in your environment, hey, something happened here. We have to get to it. So that active, right now, real time, what's on my network kind of assessment should be critical. And if your assessor can't deliver a piece of tech that does that for you, maybe you should pick a different one.
I want to expand on that a little bit. I think it's something that's pretty important too. And I've heard Tim use this discussion a lot. And I think one of the number one support call that you guys get it, and it's my favorite all time, because we always tend to think about, how is my environment impacted? How am I infected? What am I dealing with on my environment? But the number one support call you guys get, now I'm setting you up, Tim, so go ahead and
Right.
knock it out. Right?
Yep.
So what's the number one support call you guys get?
The number one support call is that this technology is active and it can block, and we'll get into the weeds. It can blacklist. And if you have a third party that's a service provider, and then all of a sudden there's a blacklist and they can't communicate with you anymore, somebody opens a ticket, hey, that's a big service provider. They're worldwide, and you're blacklisting them. What happened? And invariably, we go back through logs and we look at the policy that was generated. The AI engine in the policy in the tech generates the policy to blacklist that particular vendor. It's that their tool that's trying to connect to you has been impacted. Think of a 0-day attack. They don't know it yet. And this tech is proactively defending you. So you're left with a choice when that ticket gets opened. Either you let them in because they're a big company and they can't possibly be exposed, or the better answer, it's like, we blocked you because you're exhibiting behavior on our network that we consider high risk. And by the way, you have 15 minutes to tell us why you're doing that, right? And so it's that active with no false positives, independent of who you are, right? If you're our best vendor or our worst enemy, we are not letting you through, right? If something's wrong. And
exactly right. It's not just my infection on my system. It's the infection you're trying to bring into my system. And I think that's where it becomes critical is I'm not only protecting my environment, I'm protecting you from infecting my environment.
Right.
And that's a critical component because that is the number one support call that we get. And I think that's, it amazes me when you hear that you're actually calling your vendor up to say, hey, so-and-so ABC company, you have a machine that's compromised. I know this because X. I now can tell you you're compromised, and now you're bringing that compromising into my environment. And I think that's important. I think it's a unique perspective when you look at assessing risk.
Well, and the irony of that being a support call is that you're basically calling to say your product is working.
That's the other.
But they don't quite realize
right.
it is working.
They haven't connected the dots. Instead of it being a, hey, thank you for defending us, right?
Yeah,
yeah, exactly.
Maybe that'll be the next call when they
Maybe.
realize, oh, it's happened again and it's
hope.
working again.
Well, it leads us into the conversation, right? Security, you look at it as either risk mitigation or risk acceptance, right? I either put a mitigation strategy to eliminate the risk, or I accept that's a good risk. But the problem is a lot of times we're guessing on the data there, right? I think this is this. Now I'm telling you, this is the data that says this is an impacted system. You can decide if you want. That's a decision up for you. It's your environment. But we're warning you. You're accepting risk that you may not be aware of because of these data points. And I think the one that really highlighted this for me was Log4j, right? Everyone in December, Log4j came out, hundreds of thousands of machines, millions of machines impacted. Within 48 hours, there was a tracking, blocking mechanism, alerting mechanism within the technology for Log4j impacted environments. So within 48 hours, I now know who's bringing that Log4j exposure to my network. And I think that was really what highlighted it for me, was the ability to proactively hunt out impacted environments that are not my own.
Right. And that 48 hours, to my memory, I believe it pretty much like all of these broke over a weekend, so that 48 hours was Saturday, Sunday. And I know, just
by
talking
Monday,
with a lot of organizations, utilities are no exception, it's skeleton staff. It's just not as well, staffed at those times.
Yeah. And that's, and it's a question of, do I constantly chase the next vulnerability? Or do I proactively prevent those vulnerabilities from infecting my environment?
Right.
The choice is yours. And that's really what the tech does. That's at the end of the day, that's the end of the day, is I can decide, do I keep the bad things outside or do I risk them on the inside?
Right. You use a race car analogy, right? That people think what allows you to go fast if you're driving a fast car is the engine. And that's true to some extent. But you need really good brakes too, right? Or you only get to do once, right? One and done.
Right. Exactly.
So if you think about the way we've deployed this tech, whether it's Deception Guard working together with Remote Guard to protect your core and your remotes, we're allowing small teams to move more quickly because the engine is so powerful and gives you the opportunity to decide what what to do and writes the rules for you. To Scott's earlier point, if you have 500 locations, a nibble on one with this technology promulgates and corrects it or defends it at 500 at wire speed. So that means you don't have 499 more sets of keystrokes to do. And we'll hear, oh, I have a console, and say, right? Of course you do, right? And the point is that you need the technology to work for you, to allow you to work smart, not hard, and do it at wire speed with no false positives. And that's what we have here on the table.
Yeah, and a lot of organizations are kind of on a clock to figure it out because of the regulations that have come up for certain industries. And, in Florida specifically, we're now seeing rules about water, wastewater getting on assessments and getting on, looking at their cybersecurity strategy. And so I think that's just going to continue as a trend, either at the state legislature level or on the federal level.
Yeah, we saw this last year with the TSA directive. We saw that if you're a critical infrastructure operator, the burden of compliance to cyber regulation is the lowest it's ever going to be. It's only going up from here. Yep. That's the simplest answer I can give you. Now, we know there's last count, we were tracking 120 plus legislative cyber infrastructure around water specifically. But that being said, even if a fraction of that impacts you, if one impacts you, now all of a sudden you've got this new burden. And the warning I give you, and I watch this happen with the power industry with NERC SIP, is if you wait till it impacts you, the cost is going to be tenfold what it'll be if you properly plan today, knowing things like assessments are going to be required, compensating controls are going to be required, good hygiene in your cyber environment. If you start putting those things today, you don't have to worry about the deadlines and the critical reporting and all the additional things. And I think probably my favorite story with that was we had a very large pipeline utility, one of our biggest customers, and the TSA directive came down. So I asked the CISO for OT, is like, could you tell me, what are you guys going to do about this? He goes, nothing. I go, what do you mean nothing? He goes, Scott, I already do assessments. I already have compensating controls in place. I already locked down my environment. I can tell you everything happens on my network, what comes and goes. I have nothing more to do because I've been teased forever about being, too paranoid and too overcompensating on security. But right now I have to do nothing because I can literally send them a report on demand of anything they need to know right away. Because why I did this, because I knew at some point this was going to be a problem. Now it costs me nothing to maintain a program because it's just part of my daily budget. I don't worry about it versus starting from scratch, trying to build it all up and do it under a deadline is going to be a challenge. And finding the right resources, finding the right tools, evaluating, putting them in place, enacting remediation. Those are all things that come on beyond the assessment. Those things aren't going to go away. And all you're doing is creating a bigger challenge the longer you kind of wait to initiate a cyber program.
I mean, it's real. I mean, is there easy money for nothing, right? If you're thinking about from our sessions today, how to find funding to help develop your critical infrastructure cyber program, there are teeth with there's a pound of flesh required for the money you're getting, and it's that. And that's not necessarily a negative thing, right? It should be, right? For all of us as citizens, as consumers of these services, it should be secure. And the time to get, if you haven't started, the time is like right now, right? Right now. And if you're on the journey, it's a good time to take maybe a half an hour to assess where you are, right? Or am I getting just guidance, or are my partners actually beginning to protect me during the assessment process? I think that's key. If you're thinking about an assessment, do you have something in the assessment that can protect me today? Right? Yeah. Not just a recommendation that might take me 6 months to source and buy and implement today. Right.
Yeah,
right.
Right. Absolutely right.
Yeah. And I think that's why it's valuable, like Scott was saying earlier, to just, determine the value of what a tool is or what a vendor is telling you, that's where I hope the conversation is moving and past the do we need to do something, stage, because I think everybody knows. I mean, I was just looking on threat posts today, and I mean, there's malware as a service available over Telegram for like $400 a pop.
Right.
I mean, it's
With
like very
SLAs.
ubiquitous out there. It's very
With a
easy
service
for
level
people to
agreement, we'll give you your money back if it doesn't work.
Exactly. Yeah. So like,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, when we're at that stage of things, I hope we've evolved past like, the idea that it may not happen, because it will. So,
Well, I always reflect back probably 6-7 years when Black Energy hit the Ukraine power supply. And I remember doing my research on Black Energy tool set, which is a suite of tools. It's just like any other application. And I found it on a particular website for $62. I could license the Black Energy tool suite. So think about that. For $62, I could go attack a utility the same way I would, pay $50 to get Microsoft Word or to go get Adobe Premiere, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
I can license it out, a toolkit. So I don't even have to be a sophisticated coder anymore. I don't have to be a nation state sponsored hacking collective, right? I can be what we use the old term script kiddie, and I can be even less because now I have a support mechanism, because these are business infrastructures, a support mechanism with an SLA and a licensing agreement to go do this for $62 or $400 a month, or there's tons of these type of things. They're just like the way applications and technology is making our lives easier. The malicious entities, their lives are getting easier to attack us too.
Right.
So staying ahead, staying proactive is going to be critical.
That the rate of change. Think about the acceleration of threats in the environment. It's like everything else, whether it's the chip in your computer or your phone, or the pace of change in an attack cycle. Right? It used to be days, now pre-zero day. Right? I mean, it's wire speed, and if you're not thinking along those lines, you have some surprises in store for yourself, right?
Yeah, I mean 10 years ago, OT, I could count on two hands the number of OT incidents utilizing a specific OT target, right? I think probably 10 years ago, it was less than 20 known malicious entities attacking OT environments, right? Wasn't a whole lot. Last year, if I remember correctly, we hit over, I think, 1,200 known OT specific threats and vulnerability attacks. So that's what's disclosed. So you got to think the number that's not disclosed is 3, 4, 5x.
Right.
Yeah.
At least.
And so if you think about, look at that scaling up, right? In 10 years, we've gone from 20 or so to over 1,000. So what's the next 10 years looking like? We're going to be 10,000 vulnerabilities a year or 100,000 vulnerabilities a year.
Right.
So being ahead of it, being proactive, being tools that don't chase the signature are going to be critical.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, I think we've covered a ton of subjects today, but if there's something, you guys heard that you want to know more about, contact us, find us at graymattersystems.com. Website's on the bottom bar there. And, we can set up an opportunity to talk with Scott or with Tim a little bit more. This is just to try to, touch on some of the topics that we think about all the time and give you an introduction. But if you want to dive into the details, we can make that happen. So Scott and Tim, I really want to thank you for joining us for emPOWERUP Live. I think it was a great conversation.
Jeremy, Scott, thanks so much.
Enjoy. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you, guys.
Bye now.